The reign of the last Khan of Khans began with a war between two princes, brothers. The youngest was called Arig Bog. After the death of Munka Khan, he claimed the throne in the name of those Mongols who still lived on the steppe and who still followed the traditional way of life. His brother, Kublai, was more sophisticated. He had adopted a great many customs from Chinese civilization and wished to lead the empire down a different path. The civil war that developed in 1260 was the first time Mongol had fought Mongol since the tribal wars of Genghis Khan, and it threatened to shatter the entire empire. But the two brothers were not evenly matched. Although Arig Bog had the support of all the great Mongol families, he didn't have his brother's strategic genius. Long before any real harm could be done, Arig Bog's armies were defeated, and Kublai emerged victorious. There is nothing in the formal court portrait of Kublai, as an older man, that indicates just how different he was from the other Mongol Khans. But for a start, he grew up here, on land he inherited in northern China. Although he learned to ride and hunt like any other Mongol prince, he was also taught how to read and write. He had grown up in a land of farmers and learnt from Chinese teachers to respect and care for the well-being of the people who worked the land. By the time he was 30, he ruled a vast and extremely prosperous principality. Kublai's attachment to his Chinese subjects earned him many enemies back in Mongolia, but nothing infuriated them more than his decision to build a city on Chinese territory. This is almost all that is left of that city, Shangtu. It was built on the frontier between the steppe and the cultivated fields of northern China. Behind its walls, Kublai built a hunting reserve and had it stocked with animals for his sport. Rivers and lakes were dug, and grass was planted from the Mongol steppe. We in the West know this place as Xanadu.
In Xanadu did Kublai Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alf the sacred river ran, through caverns measureless to man, down to the sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground, with walls and towers were girdled round, and there were gardens, bright with sinuous rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree. And here were forests, ancient as the hills.
These are the foundations of the Pavilion of Great Harmony, which once stood at the heart of the palace city. The roof tiles were once bright green, the grounds decorated with altars and carved statues. Surrounding it were a number of smaller palaces and government buildings. Inside, the pavilions had gold leaf ceilings and walls lined with painted silk. The man who built this stately pleasure dome was not only extremely wealthy, he was also extremely cultured and had great vision. It was the home of the man who was about to inherit the mantle of Genghis Khan. By 1264, with his enemies cowed into submission, Kublai was accepted as the next great Khan. And so began the reign of Kublai. It was to be an illustrious one, but the unity of the empire had been strained by the civil war. It would take a man of immense resources to bind it together. The empire that Kublai inherited had already been divided into separate khanates, ruled by various descendants of Genghis. In the far west was the Golden Horde, conquered under Ogadai Khan. To the south was the Ilkhanate, ruled by the conquerors of Persia. In the center was the Chagatai Khanate, and the rest of the empire, the Mongol homeland and China, was the personal domain of the great Khan. At that time, it was the largest empire in history, yet there was still room for expansion. To the southeast lay the unconquered lands of the Sung, still the real heart of China, and a challenge to Kublai. Kublai's campaign against the Sung began with the conquest of the tiny kingdom of Dali, which lay on the borders of Tibet and guarded the western approaches to Sung China. The conquering of this remote kingdom itself was swift and bloodless, so much so that Kublai was moved to grant the people of Dali rare privileges in return for their submission. Before he moved on, he erected a pillar engraved with his instructions. There was to be no plundering of this little kingdom. It then went on to describe in detail Kublai's prowess as a general. Though led by Mongol officers, the bulk of Kublai's forces were made up of Chinese infantry. Southern China was either densely forested or covered in paddy fields, not good terrain for cavalry. So when Kublai's army set forth for Sung China, they did so on foot. These new armies had different needs. No longer could they hunt for their rations. Supply lines would have to be established. New strategies would also have to be developed. There would be no lightning raids, no set-piece cavalry battles. This war of Chinese against Chinese would take years to unfold. The Sung had a great many fortified cities, and when Kublai's forces tried to take Xiangyang, they were held at bay for 5 years. The Sung were ferocious defenders. They also had a great navy and would never be really conquered until they were defeated at sea. So again, the Mongols had to adapt to a new form of warfare. With Korean and Chinese ships, they pursued the Sung navy until it was finally destroyed in 1276. When the last male heir to the Sung dynasty was drowned, resistance collapsed. When the Mongol forces finally entered the Sung capital of Hangzhou at the mouth of the Yangtze River, they were confronted with the largest city on earth. More than 1.5 million people lived in this great seaport, and its wealth and importance to the empire was unimaginable. From here, a massive civil service governed a nation of nearly 40 million people. Built around a network of canals and waterways, it was the pearl of southern China. Along its causeways, the victorious Mongols rode into what was then the most important city in all the Orient. Its palaces, granaries, and temples were catalogued by the Mongol commanders and a census conducted of all the inhabitants. In contrast to the aftermath of previous Mongol victories, no destruction took place, nor was the Sung royal family harmed in any way. The entire campaign and the way victory was achieved was all part of a much larger strategy, not only to conquer, but to win both the hearts and minds of the Chinese. Kublai's senior wife, Chabi, encouraged this policy and urged her husband to proclaim himself emperor and founder of a new Chinese dynasty. It was extremely shrewd. By drawing on the principles of government laid down by Confucius, Kublai set about presenting himself to the entire Chinese nation as the very embodiment of Chinese thinking. His enthronement was conducted strictly according to traditional Confucian custom. This, in modern terms, was very good public relations. It meant the revival of dozens of traditional ceremonies that had not been performed at court for many years. In choosing the name Yuan for his dynasty, Kublai also turned to Confucian principles. The word Yuan has powerful connotations, for in the Confucian book, the I Ching, it means the origins of the universe. Kublai had united all of China, from the foothills of Burma to Manchuria, under a single dynasty, a single lord. By proclaiming the Yuan dynasty, Kublai gave every impression of having forsaken Mongol life, but it was not so. Behind a screen of Confucian ceremonies, Kublai established an order of racial precedence. The most important positions were held by Mongols. So, while these large outdoor rituals continued, the Chinese were encouraged to believe that life was as it had always been, in harmony with nature. But Kublai's motives were not entirely cynical. He did care about the well-being of the people who made up the most important part of the empire. The new emperor introduced tax exemptions for those trying to rebuild their homes. He built granaries, irrigation systems, and reclaimed land. He even passed a law preventing Mongols from grazing their horses on farming land. Surprising indeed from a grandson of Genghis Khan. But if the economy was to emerge from the gloom of war, it needed more than just prosperous agriculture. By nationalizing all the gold and silver mines throughout China, like this one, which dates from his time, Kublai set out to establish a government-controlled economy based round a large central exchequer. The mining or hoarding of all precious metals was forbidden. They were to be a state monopoly. From across the country, precious ore and even silver coins were transported under guard to the new state-operated mints. Here the ore was melted down and turned into imperial ingots. Soon a vast reserve of silver was produced in a variety of weights, each stamped with the official imperial mark. Kublai had effectively created a silver standard. Against these reserves, Kublai printed paper notes, which were distributed throughout the land in return for coins or silver. So, in a nation of over 50 million people, there was one official currency, and it was Kublai's. His was probably the first administration in the world to have what amounted to a central bank and a semi-planned economy. Kublai also knew that the key to a strong economy, then as now, was through production and trade. Chinese ceramics were greatly valued abroad, so he encouraged the establishment of potteries all across the south, near the great seaports. Kublai, the grandson of a nomadic horseman, issued licenses to every factory. He did everything he could to encourage production. Soon the countryside was shrouded in smoke from the hundreds of kilns that worked day and night to keep up supply. While artisans produced pottery, silks, silverware, carpets, furniture, and armaments, Kublai built a massive merchant fleet to carry them right around the Orient. He was great Khan of half the world, and he would take every advantage of it. His fleets, captained by skilled navigators, traded right across Southeast Asia, to India, and even as far west as the Persian Gulf. Here in particular, in the cities of the Ilkhanate, Chinese pottery was always in demand. But it was the trade of ideas and technology that made this sea link so important. Here, in the Gulf, Chinese merchants made a valuable discovery. The Persian artisans had developed a number of important new ceramic dyes. The most famous was cobalt. After it had been ground into a thin paste, the Persians used it to coat mud bricks before they were fired. In the kiln, this dull grey finish was transformed into a radiant blue, and the local builders were using these thick tiles to clad the outside of their domed buildings. In China, the cobalt, imported from the Persian Gulf, was used to produce the most delicate patterns. Under Kublai, Chinese potters were given free rein. They could illustrate any subject, as long as it was about hunting and horses. It was during this period that the first blue-white glazes were produced, the very best of Chinese pottery. It was a two-way trade. Chinese techniques soon influenced Persian artists. Buildings were decorated in ever more complex ceramics, and their designs reflected the Oriental influence. Though he never knew it, Kublai could take much of the credit. Kublai understood that trade across the breadth of Asia could be the means of binding the empire together. He poured fortunes into any number of projects to encourage trade. He expanded the great harbor here at Hangzhou, and each year thousands of ships were guided through the straits by a lighthouse near the mouth of the inner harbor. The old Sung capital became the most important trading center in the world. Against the wishes of his Chinese advisors, Kublai encouraged foreigners to come to his new China. Persian merchants from the Ilkhanate arrived, built trading houses, villas, and of course, mosques. Islam spread along the coastal cities, side by side with Hinduism, which arrived with merchants and craftsmen from the subcontinent. Arabs from the Gulf, Turks from Asia Minor, Russians from the Golden Horde. For the first time in her history, China was inundated with foreign cultures. The Mongol policy of religious tolerance under Kublai saw the spread of alien religions. And when the Pope agreed to establish an archbishopric in China, Kublai hailed it as evidence that his empire really was universal, and China was at the center of it. But it was Kublai's links with the great Italian city-states, and in particular Venice, that demonstrated his true internationalism. The Venetians had traded in Oriental cargoes for years, but only through Persian middlemen. But now there were encouraging reports that there was a safe overland route leading directly to Cathay. And Venetian merchants hoped to get there first. In 1271, Niccolo, Maffeo and Marco Polo set off from a house which once stood here. Their destination, the land of the great Khan. When they departed, the Venetians thought they might be away for 2 or 3 years. They were away for 17, and Marco Polo's book, written and illustrated on his eventual return, was closely studied by traders and medieval geographers. He described in detail his journey across Asia to Kublai's fabled city of Shangtu. There they were granted an audience with the great Khan and delivered letters of greeting from the Pope. The Polos were followed by other European merchants. To aid their journeys, Kublai built along the route 1,000 new post stations, or caravanserais. Each was provided with a hostelry, a granary, stables, and fresh pack animals. It was the start of a remarkable era in the history of trade. All along the great Khan's highways, hundreds of merchants traveled back and forth. For the first time, East traded with West, face to face.